Okay, let's unpack this story. We're starting today with this really powerful image, right? March 6, 1957.
Ghana's independence.
Exactly. Ghana, which was the British colony, the Gold Coast, it achieves independence. And this was, well, that was huge.
Absolutely monumental. The first black African colony south of the Sahara to, break free from European rule.
And the sources, they paint quite a scene. Delegates from 56 countries are there, even U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon.
Yeah, he was there. And right at the center of it all, the heart of this historic moment, is one man, Kwame Nkrumah.
Globally, he's seen as the face of anti-imperialism, a symbol of hope.
And for his own people, the sources tell us, they often use words like
Messiah.
Messiah.
Yeah.
That's quite something. It really was an incredible moment, wasn't it? A beacon for the whole continent, really.
Oh, absolutely. It genuinely signaled the beginning of the end for colonial rule across Africa. And Nkrumah was absolutely central to that hope. Right. But here's the big question we're getting into today. Looking at the sources you've provided, how did this man, seen as this almost, faultless hero, this messiah figure, how did he end up becoming a political pariah? The kind whose overthrow just 9 years later led to people actually celebrating in the streets, the same people who once adored him.
That transition. It's incredibly complex, and the material we have, it really gives us a detailed look. We're looking at Nkrumah's journey.
His rise, that meteoric rise.
Yeah, his rise, his ambitious vision, not just for Ghana, but for all of Africa. And crucially, the policies and factors, the sources, detail that, contributed to this dramatic fall.
So our mission here in this deep dive is really to understand that trajectory, from liberator to, authoritarian ruler.
Looking at the promises, the policies he actually put in place, the challenges, huge challenges he faced, and the consequences. The sources are pretty clear on the consequences.
It's quite a story. And it really makes you think about the pressures, the temptations maybe, that came with leading a brand new nation onto the world stage back then.
Immense pressure. Okay, so let's rewind a bit, set the scene. Before independence, the Gold Coast. Firmly British control.
Right. Run from Christiansborg Castle, that old 17th century slaving fort, which is quite symbolic.
It is. And the governors, like Sir Charles Arden Clarke. Now, the British, they actually had a plan, sort of a slow, gradual transition to self-governance.
Starting with what they called semi-responsible government. So the first general election, a new assembly, mostly African representatives, but not full control yet.
Exactly. And initially, the British were working with an existing political group there, the United Gold Coast Convention, the UGCC, formed back in 47.
And the sources describe these guys as, what, men of property and standing?
Yeah, basically the established elite. Educated people, lawyers, businessmen, academics, folks the British authorities respected. Their goal, self-government in the shortest possible time. Not necessarily now, but soon.
And their leader was Dr. Joseph Bogoki Damkwa. Sounds like quite the figure.
Formidable. A barrister, an intellectual, UK-educated, well-regarded. The sources even note he drafted the first constitution proposal and, interestingly, suggested the name Ghana.
Linking it back to that ancient empire. Okay, so the UGCC, these established figures, they needed someone to, organize things full-time, expand their base.
Precisely. They needed someone to reach the wider population. And this is where Kwame Nkrumah comes in. Relatively unknown in the Gold Coast then, he'd been abroad for 12 years studying.
And that time abroad, the sources detail it. Multiple degrees in the U.S. economics, sociology, philosophy.
Then off to London. Supposedly for law, but he got really involved in activism, connected with British communists, anti-colonial movements.
Clearly politically ambitious, but the sources also mention, maybe more pragmatically, he needed an income, so the UGCC offer looked good.
Right, so he takes the job, joins Damkwa and the others. They form this core group that history remembers as the Big Six.
The Big Six. But that alliance, it didn't last long at all, did it? Less than 2 years.
Barely. The sources really pinpoint the split. The UGCC leaders were okay with the British plan, the slow, gradual transition. Nkrumah wasn't. He grew impatient.
He wanted independence now.
Immediately. Now. That was the fundamental difference. So he breaks away decisively and launches his own movement, the Convention People's Party, the CPP.
And the sources really contrast the two, don't they? UGCC as measured, elite. CPP as radical, focused on the masses.
Totally. Stirring emotions, energy. They used revolutionary songs, catchy slogans, provocative posters.
Very savvy with media, too, setting up newspapers, really pushing anti-colonial feeling.
And they didn't just promote themselves. They actively went after the colonial authorities and significantly branded the UGCC leaders as colonial collaborators. stooges.
Their slogan directly countered the UGCC. Self-government now? Much more urgent.
And Nkrumah himself, he was constantly traveling, delivering these fiery speeches across the country, promising ordinary people that, all their problems, all their grievances under colonial rule, they'd just vanish once independence came.
And he gained this massive following, the sources say. Civil servants, market traders, workers, teachers, the everyday person. Many genuinely saw him as, well, as you said, a messiah figure.
Sent to free them. He absolutely leaned into that image. That famous quote the sources mention really sums it up. Seek first the political kingdom and all else would follow.
Get independence first, prosperity comes later, automatically.
That was the idea. And this support wasn't just passive. He mobilized it. The sources talk about mass disturbances, strikes, boycotts, demonstrations, all aimed at forcing Britain's hand. Immediate self-government.
Which led the governor, Arden Clark, to declare a state of emergency.
Yep. And arrest Nkrumah and his key associates.
Nkrumah gets convicted. 3 charges, incitement, sedition, sentence. 3 consecutive 1-year prison terms.
But here's where the story takes that really interesting twist the sources highlight. His arrest. It didn't shut him down. It fired up his supporters even more.
Galvanized them. And while he's in prison, waiting for the 1951 election, they find this incredible legal loophole.
It's amazing, really. British colonial law apparently stated that any prisoner sentenced to a term not exceeding 1 year could still run for election.
And since his 3-year sentence was technically 3 separate 1-year terms,
he qualified, legally, from his prison cell.
Imagine that, running for office from prison. The sources describe the sheer excitement this caused. His candidacy unleashed this huge wave of support,
leading to a landslide victory for the CPP, which put the governor in an absolutely massive bind.
Right. The legally elected leader of the country, whose party just won overwhelmingly, is supposed to stay in prison for almost 3 more years.
Keeping him locked up risked, mass uprising across the colony, something the British really couldn't handle.
So the pragmatic choice was obvious. Nkrumah is released after just 14 months.
And the sources describe the scene: huge, jubilant crowds greeting him.
And just think about that. In 2 days, he goes from being a convicted prisoner to being the prime minister designate. Leader of government business, they called it then.
This specific turn of events, happening in Britain's most prized African colony, it sent shockwaves across Africa, across the colonial powers.
Why was the Gold Coast considered so prized? What do the sources say?
Several reasons. Its wealth, mainly cocoa, world's leading producer, but also gold, timber, bauxite, significant human capital, too, a relatively advanced education system for a colony, and a more ethnically homogenous society, which maybe made it seem more stable.
So the fact Britain was conceding independence here,
it was seen as the first major sign, the writing on the wall for colonialism across Africa. The end was coming.
And as prime minister, Nkrumah didn't waste any time, did he? He pushed immediately for full self-government. No more delays.
Right. Tabled the motion straight away. The British apparently had reservations about the speed, but they agreed. New constitution, all African cabinet. A huge step.
And this victory, it just cemented his status even more, didn't it? In the eyes of his supporters.
Oh, completely. Within the CPP, among many Ghanaians, the sources describe him reaching this kind of demigod status. Party members literally compared him to Moses leading his people out of bondage.
And the newspapers, lavishing him with titles: Man of Destiny, Star of Africa, Iron Boy, Deliverer of Ghana.
Even reports of his name being put into hymns and special prayers. It's hard to grasp that level of veneration today for a political leader.
Wow. And his personal life seems almost entirely dedicated to politics. The sources describe him as an introvert, non-drinker, non-smoker. His only indulgence was music.
Pretty much. His home was apparently always full of people seeking help. He tried to see many of them. Incredibly focused, intense.
And then finally, after this whole dramatic rise, March 6, 1957, full independence, Ghana is born.
And those celebrations were global. You mentioned the 56 countries, Nixon. Ghana was starting from a really strong position, according to the sources.
Yeah, described as one of the richest tropical countries. Efficient civil service, impartial judiciary, growing middle class, competent politicians.
And crucially, massive foreign currency reserves from the cocoa boom. It really seemed like it had everything going for it.
It really did. But Nkrumah's vision, as the sources make very clear, it wasn't just about Ghana.
No, his mission went way beyond Ghana's borders.
His grand vision. A borderless African superstate. He genuinely believed all the newly independent African colonies should unite. one Pan-African government.
And, maybe most striking, he thought it could happen in his lifetime.
He positioned Accra, Ghana's capital, as the hub for this whole liberation movement, actively supported nationalists across the continent.
And that famous line from his Independence Day speech, the sources quoted, "Ghana's independence was meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent."
That wasn't just talk, was it? It was core to his foreign policy.
Absolutely. Led to concrete actions, like hosting the All-African Peoples Conference in Accra in 1958.
Right, that brought together liberation movements from all over Africa.
300 representatives.
Yeah.
And the attendee list, it's like a future who's who of African leaders. Nyerere from Tanzania, Kaunda from Zambia, Lumumba from Congo, loads of others.
And the sources credit that conference with really boosting independence movements across the continent.
Definitely. Domestically, though, his ambition was just as huge. Transform Ghana into Africa's leading industrial power, a model socialist society.
His ultimate vision, a united Africa as a major world power, on par with the U.S. and the USSR.
And the early years, after independence, they did show some promise. The sources mention expansion in forestry, fishing, cattle farming. Cocoa production doubled.
Big projects started, like the Volta River Dam, for irrigation, but also electricity for factories, maybe even neighbors.
Plus big investments in free schools, universities, hospitals,
Mm.
which initially, at least, really solidified that man of the people image, delivering tangible benefits.
He even formalized his philosophy, didn't he? Called it Nkrumahism, set up an institute for it.
Yeah, the Institute defined it as, well, ideology for an independent, united Africa, science and tech-based, rooted in traditional African belief. Free development of each condition by the free development of all. Sounds very comprehensive, very idealistic.
But the sources are really clear here. The real-world application.
Yeah.
It didn't quite create that paradise he envisioned.
No. And this is where we really start to see the turn towards trouble.
His drive to industrialize Ghana, like, overnight.
Yeah, commissioning huge numbers of major projects all at once. Ports, roads, dams, factories. Yeah. Building everything fast, often from scratch.
And the irony, the sources point out, after years railing against foreign exploitation.
Few local Ghanaian companies could actually do these massive projects, so who got the contracts?
Often the same foreign companies the CPP used to denounce.
Exactly. And maybe worse, awarding these contracts became, well, a hotbed for corruption. The sources detail how key government members got incredibly rich demanding bribes, letting companies inflate costs for kickbacks.
It started to feel, the sources suggest, like an Orwellian animal farm society. The new elite exploiting the nation's wealth, just like the colonizers.
Nkrumah's push for socialism also led to the government aiming for complete ownership of the economy.
Which meant a huge state bureaucracy, state-owned enterprises controlling almost everything.
And with that state control came massive opportunities for corruption. Ministers treating state resources like their own property, a culture of bullying, bribery, embezzlement.
Getting anything done often meant knowing someone or paying a bribe.
There's that specific, almost unbelievable example in the sources. The cabinet minister whose wife imported a 3,000-pound gold-plated bed
From London. And when challenged, the minister, Krobo Eduse, apparently said, and this quote is stark, "Socialism doesn't mean that if you've made a lot of money, you can't keep it."
Unbelievable. He later admitted owning loads of houses, cars, bank accounts, all while in a supposedly socialist government.
And the sources even mention accusations about Nkrumah himself collecting bribes through a special company, the National Development Corporation, charging a 10–15% fee on contracts.
Those accusations are there in the material, yes. So while corruption definitely hurt his reputation, hurt the economy, the sources really identify his steady descent into authoritarianism as the most defining negative.
And that started surprisingly early. Just a year after independence, 1958, the Preventive Detention Act, the PDA.
That act gave the government power to detain anyone without trial for up to 5 years.
Framed as an emergency measure, but the sources say it was used routinely and increasingly to silence critics, opponents, anyone seen as a threat.
The numbers are chilling. The sources track detainees going from 38 in 1958 up to 1,200 by 1965.
And the human cost. The material highlights J.B. Dankwa, Nkrumah's former boss, UGCC leader, the man who suggested the name Ghana.
He became a victim of the PDA, detained without trial, died in solitary confinement after a year there. That specific story really hits home the severity of it all.
Raises huge questions about power and suppressing dissent.
Absolutely. Yet despite this, the state-controlled media, the politicians around Nkrumah, they just praised him endlessly. The sources describe his image being everywhere: banknotes, stamps, huge statues outside Parliament.
His birthday became a public holiday. Photos in homes across the country, treated more like a king than an elected public servant, as the sources put it.
The cult of personality was in full swing, but underneath, opposition was growing. And Nkrumah, he knew it, or at least suspected it.
Became increasingly distrustful even of those close to him, and moved to consolidate all power.
Decisively. 1960, Ghana becomes a republic. Nkrumah is president. But not just any president. The new constitution gave him immense powers.
Rule by decree, override parliament, dismiss officials, civil service, army, even the judiciary.
Armed with that power, he tightened his grip, used the PDA relentlessly against critics. By 61, it was a crime just to disrespect him.
He even declared his party superior to state institutions, like the civil service, unions.
And bypassed the regular courts for political cases. Set up special courts, hand-picked judges, no appeal, complete control.
And then the assassination attempts. The sources detail too.
The first, in 62, seemed to really deepen his paranoia, especially about his own party members. He arrested 3 ministers, tried them in a special court.
And when the Chief Justice found them not guilty, Nkrumah sacked him.
Immediately dismissed the judge. Pushed through a new law just to set aside that verdict. Picked a new judge. Got a guilty verdict.
Wow, the message about judicial independence couldn't be clearer.
Sentences were later reduced from death to life, but still. Then the second attempt, 64, by a police officer.
And his response: suspect the entire police force.
According to the sources, yes. Ordered them disarmed, sacked senior officers, detained the commissioner and his deputy. Undermining state institutions became the pattern.
Meanwhile, the economy, that promising start, it was falling apart.
Rapidly. Those costly projects, made worse by corruption and mismanagement, led to serious debt, a mounting problem.
But even as debt grew, the government kept commissioning more projects, tire factories, steel works, often more for prestige than actual need.
That's what the sources suggest. The debt figures are stark. By 63, 349 million. Over £6 billion today.
By 65, after this huge spending spree, 430 million, maybe 7.6 billion today, Ghana was basically bankrupt.
According to the sources, yes, bankrupt. And many of those state ventures just failed. Incompetence, mismanagement, corruption. A toxic mix.
And these policies actively alienated his early supporters, didn't they, the rural farmers?
Hugely. The Ghana Cocoa Board, the state monopoly buyer, started paying farmers much less for their cocoa.
So farmers smuggled it out to get better prices elsewhere and stop planting new trees.
Exactly. Meanwhile, inefficient state-run farms, often run by party loyalists, produced hardly anything. It was disastrous for the main export crop.
And for ordinary Ghanaians, what was the impact?
Severe. Rising prices, higher taxes, food shortages. The sources describe a population becoming deeply disgruntled.
For many unskilled workers, living standards actually fell back to pre-WWII levels, wiping out independence gains.
Back to 1939 levels, the sources state. A terrible outcome.
And internationally, that grand Pan-African dream, it was stalling too.
Badly. Despite all the energy, all the resources he poured in, the sources say he made very little real progress uniting other African states.
Many leaders opposed his vision, his socialism, his pace, like Balewa in Nigeria, Houphouët Boigny in Ivory Coast.
Strong opposition, and Nkrumah's clear preference for ties with socialist countries, USSR, China, Yugoslavia, that caused friction too.
With leaders who preferred ties to the West, UK, US, France.
Right. Things like inviting Tito wearing the Mao suit. It highlighted these divisions, deepened suspicion.
At the big OAU conference in '63, where they founded the Organization of African Unity, he pushed hard for political union.
He did, but the sources say, to his huge disappointment, not one other leader agreed.
Led to heated arguments with Nair, accusing French-speaking leaders of being puppets.
Yes, he alienated many potential allies. Accusing them of being puppets of French neocolonialism earned him their contempt, solidified their opposition.
And then the allegations that his government sponsored opposition groups, even coup attempts in neighboring countries.
Serious allegations mentioned in the sources implied Ghanaian involvement in attempts on presidents of Togo and Niger, dissidents allegedly trained in Ghana.
And Nkrumah's response was defiant. He'd continue supporting liberation movements.
That's what the sources report. So by this point, he had enemies everywhere, internationally and domestically.
Yet, despite the country being basically bankrupt, he built Job's 600, that massive office complex for the 65 OAU conference.
Costing 10 million, maybe 165 million pounds today. Nkrumah apparently saw it as the future HQ of a united Africa, a very expensive symbol built amid national hardship.
And that 65 conference in the new building, a complete disappointment.
According to the sources, yes, a result of his alienated foreign policies. 14 leaders boycotted, only 13 attended. And again, no one agreed to commit to union. His popularity was rock bottom.
So, support gone, economy ruined. His only allies left were people on his payroll.
Increasingly, yes. And becoming more paranoid, the sources suggest, he started meddling with the army, the one institution still powerful enough to challenge him.
Trying to control it. Spies, demotions, restructuring. Creating his own special presidential guard.
All bypassing the regular army command. These actions deeply angered disgruntled army officers.
They saw the low popularity, the economic mess, his interference, and they plotted.
The sources say yes. Motivated by the state of the country and their own interests, they plotted to overthrow him.
The coup happened February 24th, 1966, while Nkrumah was away.
Yeah, ironically on a peace mission via Beijing trying to help end the Vietnam War. He heard the news there.
And the reaction back in Ghana. The sources describe rejoicing.
Vivid details. Streets in Accra, Kumasi filled with rejoicing crowds. That huge statue of Nkrumah outside Parliament, pulled down by the crowds, stomped on.
And those interview snippets from the former detainees, they really bring home the human impact.
They do. Estimates of 10, 15 deaths in detention. Descriptions of being in chains, handcuffs, poor treatment, bad food, excessive lockups.
And the feeling that the coup was the only way they'd get out, that they had been told they'd be there for life.
It's a stark, powerful counterpoint to the early hope. Shows the real human cost of that authoritarian turn the sources document.
Absolutely. A sharp contrast between the promise of independence and the reality for those who ended up on the wrong side of the regime.
Nkrumah never went back to Ghana. He lived in exile in Guinea. Sekou Touré made him honorary co-president. He kept writing, pushing his Pan-African vision until he died in 1972.
And in his own memoir, written after the coup, he blamed the CIA, Western intelligence.
He alleged they orchestrated it with the coup plotters. Maintained foreign interference was the real reason for his downfall.
And that debate, the sources note, it continues today, right?
Sure.
Supporters still point to foreign interference.
Widely believed by many. But that view clashes sharply with the scenes of celebration in 1966 and the perspective of detractors, especially those who lived through the later years.
Who point to the authoritarianism, the corruption, the mismanagement.
Exactly. As the fundamental reasons. It's clear from the material there's no single, simple story here.
So summing up, we've traced this incredible path based on the sources. From charismatic organizer, independence hero, inspiration for a continent,
to a leader with a grand vision who built infrastructure.
To a figure whose grip on power, economic failures, and the corruption documented in the sources led to his overthrow, and for many, condemnation.
It's a powerful, very complex story. Gives you a real look at the challenges new nations faced, the intoxicating nature of power, that struggle between idealism and just, well, governing.
And as you hear this story through these sources, it really makes you think about those different perspectives. How history gets remembered depends hugely on whether you experience the initial liberation or the later hardship and fear.
It underscores that incredibly delicate balance leaders need to maintain. Keeping support, legitimacy. It's not easy.
It really does. And it leaves you with a lot to mull over. Given those huge hopes placed on Nkrumah, his vision for Africa, and then the stark reality of his later rule described in these sources, what does it tell you about that gap between revolutionary ideals and the messy reality of governing? How does a leader, hailed as a liberator, navigate those immense pressures and temptations of power? That's something for you to think about.